There we go. All right, guys, so we're all looking at this. So what we're going to do today is we are going to do three things. Part one is an ed puzzle. You're simply going to click on the hyperlink, and it's going to take you there. And it's all about this idea called the Protestant Reformation, okay? What I want to spend some time with you looking at today is this part two, which is the key to the religious, European religions. Now, I want to have a full disclaimer, okay? And when I say this is because I really think it's important. This is a social studies class. I'm not teaching you what to believe as far as a religion or anything of that sort, okay? That's not the point of this. I'm not teaching you what the religions believe or anything like that. Instead, what I'm trying to do is to help you understand that there is a sense of religious intolerance in Europe in the 15th, the 16th, and the 1700s, okay? And so for you to understand where that religious intolerance comes from, you kind of have to understand some of the principles of the religion and why it didn't mesh well with European monarchies, okay? So that's kind of what we're going over this stuff, and then you'll see who comes to who comes from Europe to the Americas, and then the why piece of that, okay? So that would be one of our motives, which is one of our objectives, okay? Make sense? Okay. So for this part, you can add to your notes if you want to. That's entirely up to you, okay? But you should be taking a look at this document because you need to have a sense of how everything is connected and interrelated, okay? So the first thing is all of these religions, guys, are part of one major religion, okay? They're all part of this, and they fall under this umbrella of Christianity, okay? Prior to the Protestant Reformation, there was only one religion, okay? And it's this idea of Catholicism, okay? Now, we're not here to argue and teach about what they stood for, but I want to give you some context and why there was this Protestant Reformation, okay? So in the 1300s, 1400s, all right, there is one person who rules the Catholic Church. Does anybody know who that is? Who's in charge of the Catholic Church now? The Pope, right? Okay. So the Catholic Church, we have one person who's in charge, which is the Pope. All right, and the Pope is supposedly appointed by God. Okay, it's directly appointed by God. So they're in charge, and the popes are supposed to live a very simple life. Okay, they're not supposed to marry. They're not supposed to have a life full of luxuries and that kind of thing. And what we find happening in the 13, 14, 1500s is that's not the case with some of these Catholic popes. And so enough people get upset about this, and they're questioning, are they really living that simple life like they're supposed to? And so what happens is this thought, it's called the Protestant Reformation. And your ed puzzle today is going to explain this in a lot more detail, but basically enough people are upset with what's happening with the Catholic Church, okay? So there's this idea of paying alms that people get really upset about. And it's this kind of, putting it in simplest terms, it's this idea that people pass away and they live, okay, after they die, in this place called purgatory, okay? It's this place between when you go to heaven or to hell. It's like your waiting place, okay? And so what happens is, after you pass away, in the Catholic Church at this time, you could pay alms, meaning if like these loved ones that had passed on made mistakes or errors or sins or whatever, you could pay the church, and supposedly that would help them get into heaven, okay? And so enough people question this idea of alms, as well as how the popes were living their lives, not the purest ways, and said, I don't know about this. We should rethink this. And so we have this thing called the Protestant Reformation. So Luther is one of the major figures of the Protestant Reformation. You'll learn about that in your ed puzzle today. But what happens as a result of the Protestant Reformation is we have all of these different branches that kind of come out of it, okay? And that's where all these religions fall into place. These all are a direct result of this Protestant Reformation, okay? So it's important for us to recognize why certain religions were not tolerated, and then therefore people were sent away, okay? So the first one we're going to talk about is this religion called the Church of England, Okay? Excuse me. So the Church of England is a king. King Henry decides he is not as happy in his marriage as he originally thought. Okay? His marriage, he wanted to produce an heir, and he only has one son. He's married to Catherine Aragon, and he only has a daughter. So there's nobody to take his throne when he passes away, right? Because it's passed down from king to king, so male heir to male heir, okay? So King Henry gets restless. And after being married to his wife for a long time, we're talking like 10, 15, 20 years, okay? He says to the Pope, I don't want to be married anymore, okay? And the Pope says, well, you cannot have an annulment. Does anybody know what annulment is? Anybody? Barry? It's not quite a divorce. That's the next step. Does anybody know what annulment is? It basically says that it never existed. Like the marriage never existed, so it's cleared from the slates, okay? The only problem is, guys, they had a daughter, right? So without being crass, there was obviously a relationship there, and they were married, okay? So the Pope says, we can't annul this. This is impossible. So this ticks off King Henry so much that he says, I don't need an annulment. I don't need you. I'm going to create my own church, and I'm going to divorce, like Perry just said, okay? So that's the first time this happens, is divorce. So we have the Church of England that develops, okay? And so King Henry says, well, I don't want to have a pope in charge of the church. Instead, who do you think the king wants to be in charge of the church? Don't overthink this. Himself, right? So he puts himself in charge of the church. Now, that could cause some issues, right? If your king is in charge of every aspect of your life, right, that's going to cause some issues. So we have the Church of England, the king, who says, I'm the highest power of the land. I'm above everything. I am directly related to God because of the divine rights of kings. Okay? So, the next religion then we're going to talk about is this idea of the separatists. Okay? So they wanted to separate, right? Separate from the Church of England. Okay? They're really, really radical. Okay? And the reason for this is because they believed that the king shouldn't have charge of their daily lives. Rather, there's this group of people within their congregation, the group of them, that they call the saints. And they think that those people are chosen by God to dictate how they should live their lives. Well, the problem with this, guys, is if you're saying the saints have in charge of your life, who doesn't have charge of your life? The king. And that's called treason. Okay? So our separatists are forced out of Europe, okay? They could practice religion in secrecy, which many did, or they could be killed or jailed. Many said enough's enough, and they left in the dark and then went to the New World, okay? That's why the Protestant Reformation is so important, and that's why the separatists we're learning about, they are forced out. They are not tolerated in Europe, and they're forced to move somewhere else so they can practice their own religion, okay? Who had pilgrims here for their research project? Some of you were emailing me, and you were really confused. You said, all I'm finding is like separatist information, or all I'm finding is pilgrim information. Here's what you need to know. Pilgrims and separatists are the same. The only difference is pilgrims specifically moved to what we call the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay, so that's the name for just that group. So when you think about Thanksgiving, the original Thanksgiving pilgrims, that's them. Okay, that's what they believe, the same things as the separatists. Okay, so they wanted to separate themselves from the Church of England. Okay, all right. The next branch then that we're going to talk about. Okay, the next group is the Puritans. All right, So these Puritans wanted to simply do what their name states. They wanted to purify the Church of England. They didn't necessarily want to separate, but they wanted to make it better. They wanted to reform the Church of England. And the reason behind that was they thought the Church of England was quote unquote too Catholic, okay? So there's too many practices that they thought that was happening. It was too showy, too much music, too much whatever, pomp and circumstance, okay? It wasn't as radical, but they really wanted to fix the church, okay? And then the last group, guys, that we're going to talk about is this Calvinist group. And they're pretty interesting. Okay? Our Calvinists then, our Calvinists are radical as well, okay? They believe in this elect group of people that are going to hell, this predetermination. So there is nobody who can fix what happens here on earth. It's already determined by God, according to Calvinists, of whether or not you're going to go to heaven or hell. All your decisions are determined at that point, okay? Well, guess what, guys? The king gets upset with this too, because that's treason. Nobody is above him, right? The king is the most important person. The king is the one who says who is going to make decisions and what their life is going to look like. All right? So the fact that people like Calvinists, like separatists, wanted to have others rule them besides the king was considered treasonous. Okay? Our Puritans, even though they wanted to reform the church, the king still felt like that was an offense against him because he felt like he was doing a great job, right? And so they too were considered treasonous. Okay? So, not a good place to be. So, because of that, we have our Puritans, our separatists, our pilgrims, our Calvinists. All these people are not being heard. Okay? They're not being treated fairly. And so, they wanted religious freedom. And the only way to get that was to leave their country. So, we have these groups of people who decide the New World might be the place for them. And that is why we have the motives of the first settlers, okay? The religious freedom, okay? And that's why they colonized. It was a new land, a new place for them to settle. Make sense? Okay. All right. So this is going to help you wrap it up. You're going to have to do something similar with your diagram portion of your homework tonight. So the next thing that we're going to do is you're going to work on your Ed puzzle, which is going to go into the Protestant Reformation a lot more, okay? So you answer those questions, watch that video. Once that's done, you will then take some time and answer this diagram of the European religions. It's going to wrap everything up in a nice little bow for you, okay? So similarly to what we just did on the board, it's going to put everything in here. I have some terms in this word bank. You're simply going to put them in the box, okay? Now, you cannot type in the box as I had thought you could. You're just going to take a screenshot of it, and you can write on top of it, and then insert your image into that document, okay? All right, any questions for me? All right, so the rest of the time is going to be for you to work on your Ed puzzle. If you finish that, then you can start on your homework, which is the diagram and part 3, all right?